We're so glad to have you, everyone. My name is Dr. Marie Sweeney. I'm the Interim Chief Education Officer here in Chicago Public Schools. If you've been in these forums before, you've seen my face and heard my voice several times. This is my third time partnering with the team from the Budget Office. You may remember me from the Equity Office and supporting the work here in CPS. We are once again coming back to you. Very honored to share this space with you. And so thank you for showing up. I know we're from 6 to 8. We wanted to make sure that we accommodated our families who are with us. Next slide. I'm sorry, I should have had the music on the other slides, but I will now, slide 3, please. Just to tell you, I'm thankful and grateful every single time people engage with us as the Chicago Public Schools. We really want to make sure that we're building trust. Well, folks, I know we still have a ways to go. And so this gives us an opportunity to not only give you a time to learn more about how the funding works in CPS, but also to directly hear from you and then come back to you with what we've learned. So thank you so much. And thank you to our board members who are present. I saw board member Todd Breland. I know board member Cinderlary was coming, and to all of our elected officials who are here as well. Thank you for showing up. Next slide. So we've did a little tweak to the presentation. We've heard over and over again, folks want more time in small groups. And so we've narrowed down the presentation to what's essential, which is about 35 minutes. There'll be an opportunity for small group discussions, and you can also ask clarifying questions about the information you receive. And then finally, which is my favorite part, is reporting out from the groups. What are folks saying? What do they want to know? And then how do we continue to be more and more transparent about what we do with funding in CPS? I always anchor this back, and so does the budget team, in the CPS 5-year vision that was launched in 2019, where we made commitments, next slide, to equity, and really centering on the academic progress, financial stability, and integrity. And so we believe that this gets us all to that. Next slide. Just a reminder from the CPS equity framework, my favorite piece of art in Chicago Public Schools is really how do we look at this work through an equity lens. So a part of this liberatory thinking, which is about our mindsets, this is our opportunity to challenge what we believe and think about funding, and really, be progressive in how we need to better serve all of the students across the district. Inclusive partnerships is about the inclusion of voice and who has representation at the table. This is one of the ways in which we're gaining feedback. And so we hope that throughout this session, you feel like you were involved and that we're asking you good questions and you're giving us the right information that you believe better helps you and your family and your neighbors' children. Resource equity examines where the resources now, where might they need to be, and fair policies and systems. How do we ensure that policies don't benefit some and burden others? And we said we can look at this work with an equity lens. We can take on the challenges here in Chicago Public Schools. So with that, I will now turn it over to one of the people who I've had great respect for. We've both been in education maybe 20 plus years now. And Heather Wendell, who is the Chief Budget Officer, and I have been really doing a lot of strategic work behind the scenes to make this come alive. And so to everyone who's a part of the budget team, we're excited to be here, and thank you all for coming. And I'll now hand it over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sweeney. And just to echo those thoughts and his sentiments there. So thank you all for giving of your time tonight and in other forums where you have provided feedback. And we absolutely could not do this work without you. And I personally and many of my team members are very excited. This is a culminating event for us each year. And this is the third year that we're doing this. And so we're pleased very much to be back out doing this today virtually, and appreciate the time that you've taken to join us. So thinking a little bit about this, as I said, that this is the third year of the public forums, beginning back in the winter of 2020, ahead of our FY 2020 budget process. And when we first launched this public engagement process, the goal remains essentially the same now as it did then, to examine school funding formulas and resource allocations and determine if there's a more equitable way to fund schools across the district. And your feedback has really been essential to the current and future decisions around school funding. And so part of what this presentation will do, and we've heard you say, I've come out before, how has it helped? What has it mattered? And so we're very excited to talk about direct connections that the feedback that we've received from you in these forums and elsewhere has had direct influence on the budgets for this year and moving forward. So the school funding working group is another portion and another strand of this work in our commitment to taking public feedback and further refining our processes and approach. And so in tandem with the launch of the public forums in 2019, we created a school funding working group that is essentially charged with providing recommendations to the district as well to improve school funding. And the group is comprised of representative voices of a cross function of our stakeholders. So there are principal representatives, CTU and charter school representatives, advocates, subject matter experts, governor's office expertise, and leadership from the mayor's office, the Board of Education, and CPS. And we also will be adding this year, as we enter our third cycle, additional parents, teacher, and student voices. And part of this work was really issuing an initial report that came out in April of 2020 that incorporated feedback from our first round of public sessions and outlined 6 recommendations, which my team and I and others in the district, as well as the working group at large, we continue to use these as priorities to help guide our work in the annual budget and planning process, and come back to these throughout as a touch point to ensure that we're continuing to move the work in accordance with the feedback and the recommendations. In all of these, we've continued to make progress, and you'll see some of these, correct, slide 10, thank you. You'll see some of this as we progress through the presentation tonight. Part of what brings us here is that recommendation number 3, our commitment to meaningful ongoing stakeholder engagement. There's also elements of that work that you'll see around empowering principals and LSCs and providing transparent information. And so throughout this presentation, our goal here is to continue to make good on several of these recommendations while also collecting feedback that will help us continue to refine our methodologies and further the mission and the model around equity and sustainability in our funding formulas. The stakeholder engagement is really essential to guiding our work. And these 4 core tenets here, as Dr. Sweeney mentioned, the district's commitment to equity overall and the 5-year vision, these are elements within the finance office and the budget office approach that we take on school funding and really try to ensure that the model addresses each of these areas. And so a transparency element, which is part of what brings us out into the public forum and makes us endeavor to provide information in a multitude of different ways for a multitude of different audiences, and clear and concise. Equity, as Dr. Sweeney talked about, is a core element in all of our work and our approach here, both within our school funding model and then throughout the district. We also look towards stability and sustainability. So ensuring that both at the district level and most importantly at the school level, the work that we're supporting supports school stability as well as sustainability over time and trying to limit year-over-year volatility or changes and things. And certainly, some of the last year when we were out, it was right in the throes of the pandemic. And so the feedback that we heard in a lot of those forums really had to do around some of those stability and sustainability elements. The format for these workshops are really designed to support robust dialogues and capture feedback. And so to Dr. Sweeney's point, we're going to provide some front-facing information here that's really framed in 4 level-setting questions to give some background knowledge and context. And really the heart of this forum and of the structure is to allow you to get to these small group facilitated discussions where we can gather some individual voice and feedback and hear from the group in a somewhat unique and different way. So the 4 framing questions that we'll be going through this evening is: where does CPS get its funding? How does CPS allocate its funding? How does CPS fund schools? And then again, making sure as we come 3 years into this cycle that you can see how the public input has influenced budget decisions. One couple of other elements here before we get to some of the data pieces. And so the guiding questions that we're going to be asking you to think through when you move into your small groups. And so we want to give a preview of those so you can have those kind of back of mind when you are thinking through the presentation material. but what should CPS be prioritizing right now regarding school funding? And this is from your experience, whether you're a student or a parent or a staff member, community member, but the lens of what the current state is, what the return to school has been for you and those that you care about, and the ongoing pandemic impacts, things that just resonate with you individually. What could CPS be doing to improve transparency, equity, stability, or sustainability in school funding? So those 4 core principles that we really endeavor to have in our model. And then finally, what should CPS be considering in the long term? So understanding that there is a here and now and there's this ongoing commitment. What is on your mind in terms of considerations as we think about this year, next year, and the out years? Feedback will inform both current and future work. And so today we really encourage you to have an authentic and diverse dialogue in your small groups and speak up, bring up anything that is of top of mind for you. Minor concerns may help inform some major improvements. Our near-term next steps on this will be to compile the feedback and elicit themes and incorporate this into our working group meetings and our annual planning process. And then longer term, particularly as it relates to the third question around what you would like the district to consider longer term, we're looking forward to exploring themes with the working group and as they continue their work year over year, and then ongoing stakeholder engagement, both with this group and these forums that we have and elsewhere. And at the end, we'll preview some other opportunities for you to get involved. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the Deputy Officer of our Office of Budget and Grants Management, Mike Sikowski, who's going to walk through those guiding questions that we spoke of. Mike?
Thank you, Heather. Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Sweeney and Heather mentioned, I'm very excited to be back here for the 3rd year in a row with you all in this forum. I'm excited to hear what comes out of our small group discussions. As we've discussed, this is a big part of what we do each year, and your feedback is essential to what the decisions we're making on an annual basis. Before we go into that, we want to be able to provide some context around what we do in terms of school funding, how our schools are funded, where our resources come from, so on and so forth. So we're going to start by exploring where does CPS get its funding? As you can see on this slide, CPS gets almost half of its funding from local resources, so $4.2 billion. This is primarily from property taxes and a few other smaller sources of funding. The second biggest source of funding for Chicago Public Schools is state funding, where we get $2.3 billion annually from the state. This is a little over a quarter of our total budget. The last piece of our funding comes from the federal government. And in FY22, we're slated to receive $2.1 billion from the feds. This is just under a quarter of our total budget. If you're familiar with our structural budget in the past, you'll notice that this dollar amount is a lot bigger than it has been on an annual basis. And it's because of some of the federal relief funding we've received due to COVID. We'll talk a little bit more about that a few slides later on, but wanted to give an overall breakdown of where our funding comes from. And in recent years, we've really improved our revenue structure with improvements in state funding, with some of the federal money that we've received due to COVID. But want to underscore the fact that despite some of these recent improvements, we're nearly $2 billion short of adequate funding. This is not our own assessment. This is an assessment that the state of Illinois has made of how districts across the state are funded. When they look at CPS and the resources that we have, they acknowledge that we're $2 billion short of what they think we need to be what we would call adequately funded. And so that's a big number. We use it a lot and want to make sure we can put some context around what that actually means and understand how that could feel at a school level. So this slide has our current CPS revenues at the local and state level, the total $6.5 billion. That's what we have. That translates to $19.7 thousand per pupil. The funding shortfall of $1.9 billion translates to $5.8 thousand per pupil. And so when we think about what CPS would adequately, or what we would need to be adequately funded to have the resources that we need to provide everything that the state thinks we need as a district, we would need $8.4 billion across local and state funding, which translates to a little over $25,000 per student. When we take this shortfall of $1.9 billion and think about what that means at a school of 400 students, that's $2.3 million overall. So based on the state's own assessment, they're saying that a school of 400 students really needs $2.3 million that we currently don't have to provide resources to that school. The next question on here is, how does CPS allocate its resources? So we want to give you some background on what the decisions that we have to make and how the resources go from us receiving them from local and state and federal sources to how they're allocated across our budget. So it's important to understand that the CPS total budget is essentially broken down into three parts that fund regular ongoing operating costs. And this is $8.6 billion. The first portion, before CPS is able to allocate $1 to a school or to any other activity, we have to fund our pension and debt service obligations. These are legacy obligations that we've incurred that we have to pay before we can allocate a dollar anywhere else. And this total is $1.8 billion. Want to note here that CPS is the only district in the state of Illinois that pays its own money towards teacher pensions. Every other school district in the state is part of the state teachers retirement system, the state pension system, and the state funds that. And while the state has improved funding for CPS teacher pensions, there's still a significant amount of money that's diverted from other sources into the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. The second portion of our operating and debt service budget is our central and network office administrative expenses. And this is right around $300 million. $300 million may seem like a lot, and it is a lot of money. But when we look at the size and the scope of the district that CPS is running, this is right around the national average for what it costs to run a district of our size. Finally, we get to the funds that directly support schools, and this is the majority of the funding within our total budget. So $6.5 billion of the $8.6 billion across CPS's operating and debt service budgets goes directly to schools, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So as we move into the part of the conversation when we talk about school funding, this is the portion of our budget that we're able to allocate to schools, that we're able to allocate to resources that support schools, and that we really want to get your feedback on here. If we can go back to the previous slide for one moment. Thanks. So the other portion of the total budget that I want to mention is the CPS Capital Budget. And we have this broken out separately because it's a little bit different than our operating budget. So while our operating budget funds day-to-day expenses, teachers, instructional supplies, computers, things of that nature, our capital budget funds improvements in CPS's infrastructure. So when we build a new school, when we repair a roof at a school, when we put in a new boiler at a school, this is paid for from our capital budget, which is separate and designed to fund expenses that have a longer life than 1 year, and that will last for a period of time. And so this budget is funded primarily by bonds issued by CPS, where we're borrowing money to make these improvements. And then the life of the asset that we're improving will theoretically last as long as the life of the bond. And so we pay off the asset as we go. There's $153 million in other funding that's part of our total capital budget, which comes out to just over $707 million. So now we get to how does CPS fund schools? So it's important to understand as we get into the discussion around school funding that we provide funding to schools through a variety of different funding streams that address different aspects of school resourcing. So student-based budgeting, SBB, which you may be familiar with, is our largest funding stream to schools. But I want to highlight here that it only makes up 49% of the overall funding to our schools. The rest of the funds, when we look at this chart, we see how different funding streams, how much is allocated and what percentage of the total budget is allocated through these funding streams. But we can see that they're they're not just based on the number of students. There's need factors that come into it. So supplemental aid, for example, $208 million is going out based on low income enrollments. Special education funds that support our special education students totals just under $700 million. Our equity grants here that in FY22 totaled $66 million are based fund schools in low and declining enrollment and schools with high needs. So there is a very different differentiation around school need and student need as we look at the funding that goes to schools here. And so I want to highlight that you have access to these slides, but just want to note that there's a number of different funding sources that are specific to the school and student needs at each school. Next slide, please. And so how that translates to what school funding looks like. It means that different schools have different amounts of funding based on the students that they're serving and the type of school that they're running. So this slide has 3 sample elementary schools that have different student bodies. Elementary school 1 is a large, relatively low need school. So what you see with elementary school 1 is they're getting fewer dollars per pupil in aggregate than elementary schools 2 and 3 based on the students that they're serving. There's not high needs among these students. There's not, additional factors that would drive the need for additional resources at elementary school 1. When we look at elementary school 2 and elementary school 3, these are schools of higher needs. So we see that elementary school 2 has a large proportion of special ed students and is getting a significant amount of special ed funding. They're getting Title I, which is aligned with our poverty metrics at our schools, additional bilingual money, and then an equity grant at the very top of that. When we look at elementary school 3, this is another high need school, but this is also a smaller school. And so when we look at our smaller schools, in order to achieve the same, to be able to fund the same sort of activities, they need more dollars per pupil, where we've seen declining enrollment over the years. So, elementary school 3 is funded at just over $12,000 per pupil. We see there's a significant portion of their budget is through the equity grant at the top of that chart on the right, and they're getting much more need-based funding than elementary schools 1 and 2. Finally, coming back to what we talked about earlier in terms of overall funding need at CPS, while we do differentiate based on student need, and we have introduced different equity metrics into the budget over the years, we want to highlight that despite this differentiation, all of our schools still need additional funding. And so even though elementary school 3 may be getting more than 2 and 1 based on the needs of the students and the size of the school, they are still underfunded, as are elementary schools 1 and 2. And so in the instance that the state or the feds were able to come up with additional dollars, we'd be able to distribute that across all of our schools and improve the funding levels at each of them. So the last question here, and this is new for this year, and again, this being the 3rd year that we're back, we really want to have a discussion about how public input has influenced budget decisions. Really want to emphasize that the feedback here is important, that it's valued, and that it really does live up in the decisions that we make and the funding that goes to our schools. So the first piece of feedback that we'll discuss is CPS finding ways to improve equity in school funding. Want to highlight here that the FY22 budget included $66 million in equity grants for CPS, which was a record high. FY22 was the 3rd year that we issued equity grants, and this is substantially higher than it was in FY21 and FY20. Also want to highlight here that $26 million of the $66 million went out using CPS's Opportunity Index. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the Opportunity Index is an index developed by Dr. Sweeney and his team to analyze differences in access to opportunity structures, and understanding how equity plays out across the district, understanding how student need plays out across the district, and really understanding at a student by student and a school by school level what the different needs are at each school. As we've gone through the process each year, and as we've heard from you all, one of the things we've tried to continually get better at is really understanding the degree of need, the nuance of student and school need, and make sure that the dollars are targeted where they're most needed. So in FY22, introducing the opportunity index into our funding formula really allowed us to direct different dollars to where there was the highest degree of need. And this slide highlights some of the factors that go into the opportunity index. So again, being able to understand at each school, based on the students that they're serving, really what the differentiated level of need is at each school. So we're looking at the percentage of diverse learners, the percentage of students qualifying for free and reduced lunch, the percentage of limited English proficiency students, so on and so forth, to really be able to say, to differentiate one school to the next in terms of what the depth of need looks like across all of our schools. The second piece of feedback we received in last year's public forums was that CPS should consider the impact of the pandemic on school level enrollment. So last year, we were in school remotely in the fall, and we use our prior year fall enrollment data point as the basis for initial budgets when we release school budgets in the spring. So we went into spring of 2021, getting ready to release school budgets, understanding that what we had seen in terms of fall enrollment was impacted by the pandemic, impacted by remote learning, impacted by what we were going through at the time. We heard that loud and clear in the public forums, and we didn't want to penalize schools for any out of trend, any differences in enrollment because of the pandemic. What we did in the FY22 budget was invested $32 million to address some of these pandemic related changes. So when we think about our budget methodology, the fact that we're using the prior year enrollment and funding schools at that level and no lower than that to improve school level stability and eliminate fall budget cuts, this was another improvement we introduced to make sure that schools weren't impacted by anomalies due to the pandemic. So this $32 million went out to 262 schools. And on the next slide, we have an example of how a school fared with the changes to the methodology around enrollment. So here's an example of a school who lost a significant amount of students in last fall, so fall of 2020, and how their budget was impacted by the loss of that enrollment. So this school went from 259 students in FY20 to 201 students in FY21. Based on the methodology that we've used in the past, the 201 student data point would have been the basis for this school's enrollment-based allocations. When we look at how it compared to the prior year, however, we see that was a loss of 22.4% of its overall student body. That was out of trend for this school, who had typically been losing under 7% of the students each year. So rather than set this school's budget at 201 students and fund them based on that number, we used a hypothetical enrollment input of 241 students that utilized the 3-year trend data to come up with a hypothetical enrollment that we would have expected at the school, but for the pandemic. This school received funding, their enrollment-based funding streams based on 241 students, and was guaranteed at least that level of funding this school year. The last piece of feedback that I want to highlight here was essentially responding to some of the new needs created by COVID at our schools and for our students. So last year in the public forums, we heard a lot about prioritizing resources for communities most impacted and harmed by COVID, funding SEL and mental health supports, addressing the enrollment impacts, which I mentioned previously, doing things to address learning loss and us being in the remote environment for some time, and then supporting stability and a safe return to school, improving some of the things that we learned about during remote learning around virtual learning and technology, and then really providing decision-making to the school level. So providing resources so that each school can meet the needs of its own students, its own unique community needs. In response to this, want to highlight here that the FY22 budget included over $1 billion of federal ESSER funding. This is relief funding from the federal government to address these needs at the school level. Really want to emphasize that all of these dollars are either living in schools or supporting students, supporting schools, and the things that we know are needs coming out of the pandemic. So what this pie chart does is break down that $1 billion across the various ways that these dollars are supporting our schools and supporting our students. So $267 million for academic recovery and SEL supports as part of our Moving Forward Together plan. We've allocated $132 million to student re-engagement and school opening costs to really make sure that we have students back in the building and that our buildings are ready and safe and able to support student return. We've invested $100 million in air quality improvements in our buildings, $288 million in school-based programmatic investments so that we're able to continue to make some of the investments that we know are driving outcomes in our schools. $178 million in school-based instructional positions to make sure that we're not introducing any instabilities in our schools due to the pandemic, and that we're able to retain continuity of staff. And then finally, $95 million as part of the charter school and contract school proportionate share of the funds that allows charter and contract schools to do what's necessary at their buildings. So with that, really wanted to emphasize how some of this feedback lives in our budget and some of the decisions that we make. And I look forward to hearing what we share out from our discussions tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Heather and Wendell for the next part of this presentation.
Thanks, Mike. So I know that was quite a bit to digest, and I know we talked about having access to the deck, and that's been dropped in and things. We do want to move you to the small groups here, and you'll spend about the next hour or so there. Quickly, as you move, I want to bring up 2 slides related to this again, and you'll have access to these materials in your groups. But the next slide, 32, shows again those guiding questions. So what should CPS be prioritizing right now regarding school funding? What could CPS do to improve transparency, equity, stability, and/or sustainability in school funding? And what should CPS be considering in the long term? And so when you break from here, you'll be joined into a virtual breakout session where you will be greeted by a facilitator who will walk you through sort of the next portion of this and these questions, taking notes and things of that sort. The next slide, slide 33, gives a preview of what you'll do when we come back to the room. So you'll spend about an hour in the breakout sessions. There'll be a note taker there that's recording responses to the questions on the prior slide, as well as working with you guys to come away with 3 elements that we'll ask for you to share when we all get back together on the same Zoom as a group. And so listing 1 key takeaway from your small group discussion. What's one area you'd like to know more about? And what are voices that may have been missing from your small group room? And then ask to have a representative read the responses. And so Dr. Sweeney will be leading us back through that large group share out at the end here. So with that, I'll ask that we skip back to slide 32 that has those guiding questions on it. That'll be a big portion of your facilitation coming up. And then I'll ask Ben and the team to do what needs to be done here to move folks into the small group sessions here. And we'll call everybody back around 7:30, 7:35. So see you guys soon.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your time in the groups. I heard a lot of if we could do these now solutions, and I also heard some long-term ideas to better serve our young people within schools. I will quickly go to each group. I will name the group by number, and then if I need to call on somebody in that group. So I'm not sure if everyone knew the number of their group. So I'll start with group 1. And Tony, if you could, either you or somebody from your group, just share out some of the answers to the responses, or what do you believe is sort of a summary of what you heard? Of course, we will make sense of the notes later, but this is an opportunity for us to hear across groups to just see what we take away from these sessions. So Tony, I'll start with your group.
We've got Principal Jasmine. She's going to speak for our group.
Hi, Principal.
Hi, Dr. Sweeney. Thank you so much, Group One. I wasn't in the other groups, but I think Group One was the best group. And so some of the things that came out of there, specifically when we talked about who was missing from the table. So we believe teachers, students, and community members really need to be a part of these conversations so that they can be best informed. In terms of what we think the district really needs to prioritize, we said workforce recruitment and retention, but particularly creating a pipeline for increasing the workforce and ensuring the sustainability for that. And then last but not least, the third question was, what's the big question that we have? And that is how, or better yet, what will the district do to ensure the sustainability of like school funding? So beyond this year and even next year, what are some innovative and creative ways and partnerships that we can establish to ensure that the sustainability of funds and the impact of those funds don't wane over time?
Got it. Thank you, Englewood CAC Principal of the Year. I saw that, Ms. Sylvana, so thank you. Group number 2.
Hi, I'm representing group number 2. I'm Molly Alvarez. I am from Harriet Tubman Elementary, and really appreciated the dialogue in group 2, all of the different voices and experiences from everyone. I learned a lot, which is always fun for me. In terms of the big idea, what we came away with is really prioritizing right now the safety and social emotional learning from students, the importance of interventionists, both from a social emotional standpoint. Heard stories of a principal who's had to write up more, I forgot what she called them, but anyway, more misconduct reports this year than she has in the past 3 years combined. So students are suffering in a lot of those social emotional ways, and we need to give students the opportunity to have those interventions and then have the tools to help support from a social emotional way, but then also from a missed learning opportunity. Students often had very different outcomes within this pandemic, and so prioritizing that is definitely an important part. Missing from the conversation, we also agreed that student voices and staff voices are very important. The stories that they live and breathe and share every day are important to contextualize what's actually going on in each of the schools. So we really would appreciate that opportunity. And then similarly, in terms of what we want to know more about, it's that sustainability question as well. You know, really having that opportunity to, you know, plan long-term, to be able to understand, knowing that there were federal COVID funds this year that aren't coming back next year, so that schools aren't able to plan staff with those funds. So how can we long-term help schools out? Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Molly. Good to see you. It's been a while.
It has been. Thank you.
Group 3.
Hi, this is Joyce Rogers. We had a lot of the same responses as group 1 and 2. We really focused in and talked about that SEL piece, that social emotional learning for our students, because a lot of students have been traumatically affected by what happened during COVID. They've lost parents, they've lost grandparents, and it's hard for them to come in and focus on learning if they've had a traumatic experience due to COVID, because we were on virtual learning, trying to still make everything happen. And then we just kind of talked about, what does that look like? How can we continue that funding? How can we follow students when they transfer to other schools and charter schools? And how can, you know, we support staff in the school? Because staff has also been affected by, the pandemic. And so, because we've had a lot of teachers that just left the profession. So we want to see how can we support that to get back to the level of learning that's expected. And I think we said who was missing at the table. We said students are missing from the table, community representatives, teachers, health providers, nurses, counselors, doctors. We need all of the stakeholders to be here to support what we're doing so that the funding can be placed where it needs to go so that we can support our students.
Thank you, Joyce. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I hear the whole school approach as a theme coming up. Group 5, I'm sorry, our Spanish group first.
Thank you. Adela, our parent, is going to share, and we will need an interpreter, please.
Buenas tardes, yo soy de la Escuela Berry y Marín y Roche. Estamos de acuerdo con todos los demás grupos de lo que estaban diciendo, pero también nosotros queremos saber cómo como CPS nos pueden apoyar a nosotros como padres, porque cuando tenemos un tope que no nos dejan avanzar, digamos, tenemos un problema y llegamos hasta cierto límite y no tenemos esa información nosotros como padres, ¿dónde podemos ocurrir para ver la importancia que tienen los padres y los derechos, y también fundamentalmente que apoyen a las escuelas y que sean igualitativas con todas las escuelas y que nos puedan apoyar a los padres como a los estudiantes? Yo sé que ahorita en esta mesa debe de estar los estudiantes principalmente, que son los más importantes, y el jefe de arriba que escuche las opiniones de los estudiantes, que son los que más están adentro, los que más tienen el impacto, lo que está pasando, y sobre todo la seguridad con los estudiantes y cómo podemos nosotros como padres apoyarlos a ustedes y que nos apoyen a nosotros en base de lo que hemos pasado. Estoy de acuerdo con todos los demás, pero también está importante la seguridad de nuestros estudiantes, cómo apoyar a nuestros estudiantes y que los padres tengamos los recursos, dónde correr cuando hay un problema y que no nos escuchan, dónde tener esa información, dónde subir más arriba para que los padres, para que llegue directamente a la persona especial para que nos escuchen, porque a veces hay cosas que pasan en la escuela y se quedan nada más ahí y no suben. Y siempre pasan problemas con los estudiantes, con maestros, pero no nos dejan avanzar, nada más nos cortan. ¿Dónde podemos tener esos recursos nosotros como padres? También, que es muy importante para todos, para toda la comunidad en general, y tener esa ayuda con ustedes para no romper la confianza que tenemos con ustedes, porque la verdad muchos padres de nosotros estamos poquitos decepcionados cuando ustedes hablan de apoyo, pero a veces no lo dan como debe de ser. Tiene que ser, como dicen ustedes, tiene que ser igualitativo para todos en general, pero también debe de basarse bien en las necesidades de cada comunidad y cada escuela, pero que sea bien información correcta de lo que está pasando. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adela. I think one of the themes I heard in other groups as well was who do you contact for what? And we do need to make that clearer. Thank you. Group 5.
Hello, this is Sharon Thompson-Saffold. Group 5 felt that the voices who were missing were non-CPS families, specifically those who were making decisions about whether to send their children to CPS, which of course impacts CPS's long-term viability, as well as current parents and community stakeholders, of course. The two questions or two takeaways were, one, we think funding should be spent on social emotional support for many of the reasons the other groups mentioned. Children just need a little help now after this pandemic, and we're still in it, but moving away from it, certainly, moving out of it. Children need help re-engaging with the in-person classroom setting, and teachers are seeing that all over the place. And so many funds need to be devoted in that area. Also, there needs to be improved transparency on the capital budget side. More specifically, development of a roadmap that would help parents to understand the various allocations, the budget allocations, and where money goes and why it goes there. And also to help to improve distribution of the information, making it more palatable for parents, and making better connections between the capital budget and the operations budget, so that it's viewed, although they're two separate buckets, we need to see some continuity between the two to better understand at the parent level as well as the local school council level. Thank you for your time. This was a great meeting tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Group 7.
Hi, good evening. Our group, we focused our big idea around the need to focus on education and improving the quality of education. So the big idea was really about how we would look at selective enrollment schools to mimic what they do and make it standard at the other schools to ensure that the best quality of education is provided to all students within CPS. As we know, there's a lot of children leaving our school system. I think we had about 10,000 kids the last report. Families are looking for the basic needs of education, which during COVID, there's a wider gap now, especially with children who have special needs, and ensuring that, we have a system in which, the idea of selective enrollment and why a parent would want to go to, for example, in Inglewood to a high school and want to fight to get into that high school. I think we need to be able to provide that. In terms of who's missing at the table, basically it's the same, right? Students are missing at the table, and yeah, our students, we need to bring them and hear from them also. So thank you again very much. This was great.
Thank you, Carlos. Group 8.
Hi, this is Principal Horton. Group 8, we spent a lot of time talking about Tier 1 instruction and also reading. My group was very much concerned about making sure that we identified struggling readers early and began to address those needs. We're very much aware of the fact that the district has implemented the Wilson Reading program, which we liked. However, some concerns that we had centered around this idea of making sure that schools had more staff that were trained to address that. Because as we've come back off the pandemic, what we're finding is that there are more students who are struggling than we even had prior. And we want to be able to provide those services to more students who we now see need it. The other thing that we spent a great deal of time talking about is that when you look at the district's data as it relates to reading, that, we're leaving, there's 40% of students that, are still needing to be addressed, and we don't want to leave. My group didn't want to leave that many students on the table needing that support. In terms of what's one area that we'd like to know more about, that's centered around this idea of maintenance for our buildings. And a question that we kept coming back to is, yes, we recognize that we are underfunded as a district, but thinking about in these buildings that we know have major repair needs, like how are we going to prioritize the most egregious things that are needed for safety? And by when do we anticipate, or when do we think we will have a plan for when those buildings will be as safe as we can make them given our available resources? And then finally, we also said that in terms of who we believe are missing from the table or the room, just like many other groups, we said that it was students, but we also made a suggestion that in the same way that we're having this conversation tonight, perhaps consider doing a student forum, but during the school day, in order to give kids a chance to voice their thoughts and opinions, and that might be a way to bring them to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Principal Horton. Very good point. We can figure out the student. I think that's an excellent idea. Last but not least, Juliana, I think if you're the spokesperson for your group 9.
our big idea was really centered around safety. And so safety for our students, not only within the school in terms of COVID, so mask wearing, I think has gone decreased considerably, but also, temperature taking and things like that. We also talked about the need for safety of like infrastructure issues, I think that were just brought up as well. So for instance, lead in water and whether that's going to be addressed as the structural level for a lot of these schools, a lot of these older buildings. And then also I would put under there social emotional like trauma for students and making sure that they are, taken care of. In terms of who's missing, we echo, all the other groups, students, teachers, social workers, principals, of course, more parents, the community members, elder people. We know that, it takes a village to bring up our kids, and this is right, there's schools in our community, and we really need everyone weighing in these meetings. One of the areas that we would like to know more about is really about equity amongst schools. We know that certain schools perform better. We know that there are issues with schools that are, what happens when a school is considered less desirable? Where's the funding and the input to bring up that school, right? Right now, if it's really based off of who wants to go there, student enrollment, right, then there becomes this issue of there's a cyclical nature of this, right, like you can't improve your school because you don't have the students that want to come to the school, but they don't want to come to the school because you don't have the money to improve it, right? So where is the funding ideas that draw funds towards schools that need an extra hand, basically?
Thank you. Thank you all. It is 8 o'clock. I'm going to turn it over to Heather for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sweeney, and thank you all for being here. So just to reiterate a few near-term next steps, so we'll be compiling feedback here and incorporating that as elements of our 2023 process in terms of budget strategic planning. Longer term, working through this with the working group, Vice President Revelari, board member Todd Breland, who are both present tonight, are board members on that working group. We're so pleased to have them and their expertise and their voice in that space. And then certainly ongoing stakeholder engagement in this group and elsewhere. And so to that end, there is an accountability redesign survey that I want to share with you all as well. My colleagues in that group are working to do the same type of engagement and currently, working to make sure that we're gathering feedback in that space as well. And so the survey will be made available in the chat for everyone, as well as we will provide those that provided email addresses and things. We will send materials out following and a link to the survey and things. I want to echo the sentiments coming through the chat and coming through elsewhere here. Thank you all for those that spoke on behalf of your group, sharing your ideas, your thoughts, your time here with us this evening. Thank you to all the participants, our partner groups and FACE and LSC and IGA for being here and bringing your voice and your expertise to this. To my amazing team, many of the facilitators in your small groups were representatives of the Office of Budget and Grants Management, and we get a lot of positive feedback about this opportunity. The team very much looks forward to hearing directly from the stakeholders that we are here to serve day in and day out. So appreciate my team and certainly you all willing to share your thoughts and ideas with them. And please tell your friends the voices that you said were missing from this conversation. Please let them know we're holding another session on Thursday of this week from 4 to 6. The RSVP is still available on the CPS website. And we look forward to coming back again with additional feedback and ways that your inputs and ideas and thoughts and expertise have shaped the work that we're doing to make it better for schools and school communities. So really appreciate the time. Thank you all and have a good evening. Thanks.